The answer is I don't, nor would I necessarily want to. It all stemmed from, might as well say it, might as well emphasize it, because I'm fed up with getting letters from people all the time.
At 75 years old, King Charles is not supposed to surprise anyone anymore, yet his latest reflections have done exactly that. For decades, the world has whispered, guessed, and argued about what he really felt for Diana, for Camilla, and for the crown itself. Now, as a 75-year-old king looking back on a lifetime of duty and desire, Charles is finally admitting, in his own careful way, what so many of us suspected all along. Before we uncover that quiet confession, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because what is happening inside the palace right now will make this story feel even more intense. Stay with me, because once you see how his past and his present finally fit together, you may never look at King Charles the same way again. To understand what Charles is admitting at 75, you have to start with the boy everyone thought was too soft for the throne. While his classmates at Gordonstown hardened themselves against the cold, the bullying, and the brutal discipline, young Charles shrank inside, clinging to books, music, and the rare moments of kindness he could find. He was raised in a world that worshipped stoicism, yet he felt everything too deeply. His father wanted a tough soldier. Instead, he got a sensitive dreamer who wept at music and worried about injured birds in the garden. The irony is that the very trait people mocked, his sensitivity, would shape every decision that later tore his life apart. Even in the military, where he surprised everyone by proving himself a capable pilot and naval officer, Charles never learned to silence his need for emotional connection. That need would make him an empathetic king, but it also made him dangerously vulnerable as a young prince. Because when a woman finally appeared who seemed to understand him completely, he held onto her with the quiet desperation of a man afraid he would never be loved for himself. Her name, of course, was Camilla. To the outside world, she was merely another debutante, but to Charles, she was a refuge, someone who laughed at his jokes, teased him out of his moods, and treated him not as a future king, but as a flawed, funny, complicated man. Their early romance has been picked apart for years, yet the core truth is simple, and Charles, at 75, no longer runs from it. He loved her in a way that felt real, messy, and alive, and he never fully stopped. But the royal machine does not care about messy, and it certainly does not care about alive. It cares about stability, optics, and the brutal mathematics of succession. Camilla, divorced and seen as unsuitable, did not fit the image of a future queen, and Charles was reminded over and over that his heart was a private luxury, while the crown was a public obligation. So when a shy, beautiful teenager named Diana Spencer appeared, with the right background, the right innocence, and the right public appeal, the path was laid out for him whether he wanted it or not. To the world, their engagement looked like destiny. To Charles, it felt like a crossroads where every direction led to pain. He could defy his family, his government, and centuries of expectation by insisting on Camilla, or he could do what was asked, marry Diana, and hope that affection would grow into the kind of love people wrote about in fairy tales. You and I know which path he chose, and history has never stopped debating whether it was cowardice, sacrifice, or something in between. On the surface, the wedding of 1981 was pure magic. A glittering gown, a glass carriage, and a young bride who seemed to embody every dream the monarchy wanted to sell. But behind the balcony kisses and choreographed smiles, there was a simple, brutal truth that Diana sensed early and the rest of us only admitted later. She was marrying a man whose heart was already divided. Over the years, fragments of that reality leaked out. The bracelet Charles had made for Camilla right before the wedding, the awkward interviews where he dodged simple questions about love, the way his eyes seemed to glaze over when Diana dazzled the world alone. And then came the public admissions, the interviews where Charles acknowledged his affair with Camilla once the marriage had, in his words, irretrievably broken down. By then, many of us felt we already knew the headline. He had never stopped loving Camilla, and he had never learned how to love Diana the way she needed. But there is a difference between the public putting the pieces together and the man himself finally, honestly, joining those dots. That is where 75-year-old King Charles quietly changes the story. In recent years, in carefully worded interviews and offhand remarks to friends that have made their way into biographies, he has stopped pretending that his life neatly followed the script written for him. Instead, he has begun to acknowledge, sometimes directly and sometimes between the lines, that the collision between his heart and his duty left real casualties. He speaks with open tenderness about Camilla, not as a convenient second wife, but as a steady, sustaining presence who walked beside him through years of scandal, rejection, and doubt. He admits that without her, he might never have survived the relentless scrutiny that turned his private misery into worldwide entertainment. And in the same breath, he has begun to speak of Diana not just as the glamorous princess frozen in photographs, but as a young woman drawn into a story that was already broken before she arrived. When he talks about the pain of that era now, there is less defensiveness and more acceptance, a quiet recognition that his choices, however pressured, caused wounds that never fully healed. He cannot say everything outright. A king never can, but if you listen closely, you can hear the admission underneath the polished phrases. Nobody won. When you strip away the fairy tale and the fury, what remains is a family that's splintered under the weight of an institution. And at 75, that is the point Charles seems most willing to face. For years he defended, explained, and justified, but the older he becomes, the less energy he has for pretending that anyone emerged from that story unhurt. Friends who have spoken to royal biographers say that when Charles looks back now, he does not see himself as the tragic hero or the villain. He sees a man who allowed events to carry him, rather than finding the courage to redraw the script. And in that quiet, painful admission lies what so many of us suspected. He knew even then that marrying Diana while still emotionally tethered to Camilla was a choice that could only end in damage. Picture him now at 75, hair thinning, hands swollen by the health issues the tabloids love to zoom in on, sitting at a desk piled high with red boxes and historic documents. On the wall behind him hang paintings of ancestors who ruled empires, led armies, and reshaped continents. In public, he follows their example, steady, dutiful, unflappable. But in private, according to those who know him, the conversation has shifted. He talks less about what the crown demanded of him and more about what his choices demanded of others. He wonders what kind of woman Diana might have become if she had not been drafted into a doomed marriage at 19. He wonders what kind of father he could have been if there had been less bitterness, fewer headlines, more courage to tell the truth early. This is not the glamorous confession of a king sobbing on camera. It is something quieter, more unsettling. It is the realization that time does not give you the chance to rewrite the past, only to finally tell the truth about it. For years, the official line was that the marriage simply broke down, as if it were a house with faulty plumbing, nobody's fault, just unfortunate. Now, when Charles speaks, there is a different emphasis. He talks about how ill-prepared he and Diana were, how incompatible their needs and temperaments turned out to be. But he also acknowledges, in the way he chooses his words and in what he leaves unsaid, that he walked into the marriage with a divided heart. That is the admission. Not a courtroom confession, but a moral one. He was not the husband she imagined, and deep down he knew he never would be. The man who once shrugged and said, "Whatever love means," now speaks openly about love when he mentions Camilla, about gratitude, partnership, and the comfort of having someone who has been my constant support. He does not have to say the next sentence out loud for people to hear it. If Camilla is his constant, then she always was. That is what the world long suspected and what his own words now quietly confirm. The contrast could not be sharper. A young prince who downplayed love as an unclear concept, and an older king who finally admits that love, denied or mishandled, reshaped every life around him. He does not dwell publicly on the worst moments, the phone call tapes, the televised interviews, the night Diana told the world there were 3 people in the marriage. But by praising Diana's warmth and her impact, by stressing again and again how proud he is of the sons she raised, he signals something important. He understands that, in the hearts of many, she will always be the wronged one. And instead of fighting that narrative, he has begun to live with it. You may notice that in recent years, palace statements and royal documentaries have leaned into a more human picture of Charles. The workaholic grandfather planting trees, the man who talks to plants, the environmentalist who warned about climate change decades before it was mainstream. That is not an accident. It is partly public relations, yes, but it also reflects a man trying to show that he is more than the sum of his worst decisions. He knows there are people who will never forgive him for Diana's pain. At 75, he no longer tries to argue them out of it. Instead, his admission comes in the form of radical, for a king, honesty about his limits. He has described the crown as a heavy responsibility, and those around him say that behind closed doors he is frank about the loneliness that came with being the longest waiting heir in history. That loneliness he now accepts made him cling harder to the one person who felt like home, even when it destroyed his public image. So yes, the world suspected that Camilla was always more than a fling, that she was the emotional center of his life, and at 75 he no longer hides that. But there is another suspicion he finally validates, one that cuts even deeper, that the system he represents can crush the very people it relies on. When he talks about slimming down the monarchy, about making it more responsive and less remote, you can hear a man who has lived through the human cost of silence and pretense. It is easy to dismiss that as strategy, a way to modernize an ancient brand. It is also, if you look closer, an attempt to ensure that what happened to Diana, to him, to Camilla, does not happen in quite the same way to William, to Catherine, to the next generation standing nervously in the wings. Will that be enough redemption for you? Maybe not. You might look at 75-year-old King Charles and still see the man who broke a princess's heart. Or you might see an aging king who finally stopped hiding the fact that his private life was a mess long before it exploded on television. Either way, his late-life honesty changes something. It confirms that the fairy tale was never real, that your suspicions about divided loyalties and buried regrets were not the inventions of gossip magazines but reflections of a deeper truth. Behind the crown, there was always a man who wanted to be loved and a woman who wanted to be chosen, and history would only grant one of them their wish. So now the question turns to you. Hearing what Charles has finally allowed the world to see, his enduring love for Camilla, his regret over Diana's suffering, his acceptance that nobody truly won, does it soften your view of him, or is it far too late? Do you see a selfish prince who hid behind duty, or a wounded man trapped by expectations he never had the strength to refuse? Let me know what you think, and if you want to keep uncovering the truths behind royal headlines, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because as King Charles moves deeper into his reign, every choice he makes will be measured against the very admission he has finally allowed to surface. That duty without honesty can destroy the very people a crown is meant to protect.